Florida Maki, over the last year, you have made some pretty wild, in fact, outlandish claims about the state of Florida. You have, in fact, said that it's really no longer even a state, that it is now governing itself as its own republic. Well, I stand by those statements. Culturally, de facto, on the ground, there could be no wider gap between how Floridians see the world and the vast majority of the contiguous 48 states. We believe in liberty. And there are those in other states who do believe in liberty as well. But in governance, we have, I guess, what you would call a critical mass of those believing in liberty. Now, I would like to share with you today a clip from someone in California who identifies with Floridian culture and doesn't really even know it. Mahatma Gandhi said, "A nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the soul of its people." I want you to remember this statement. A nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the soul of its people. This is an individual, Kim Iverson, and she identifies as a progressive, and she lives in California. But I want you to listen to these 4 minutes and tell me if this is something that you don't think you would hear from a Floridian.
When it comes to topics, really all topics, but specifically history and science, these topics need to be discussed openly. Instead, we have this culture of diss rather than discuss, and we should be discussing differences in viewpoints when it comes to historical happenings, what really were the causes of history. Science, we've seen this throughout the pandemic. Science has been silenced rather than openly debated. We used to have a culture of if a doctor gave you a diagnosis, you would go to another doctor for a second opinion. Now suddenly you're not allowed to have a second opinion. And we do know that when it comes to history, the victor gets to write what is written in the history books. But not only that, but we should be able to always look back at history and dissect it and pontificate on it a bit more than just what we read in our history books. And that is what Whoopi Goldberg apparently wanted to do. And she has a different view of what happened. She has a different view as to why things unfolded the way that they did. Plenty of people do. She's not alone in her viewpoint. Believe it or not, a good chunk of people actually agree with Whoopi Goldberg. Maybe not her audience, because The View has cultivated a particular type of audience that's watching them, but plenty of other people actually said, I don't know if Whoopi Goldberg was particularly wrong. And that is why her ideas should be discussed rather than just dissed, rather than silence her and sideline her for 2 weeks. Why can't this be a topic of discussion? If you're not going to discuss history and instead it's just going to be something that, no, you read what's in the history book, you accept it, and then you just regurgitate it, and there's no room for nuance, no room for disagreement, no room for discussion, then why are we even learning history? Are we learning it because we're wanting to learn from the past? We're wanting to use those examples, have discussions, and prevent them from happening again? Or are we just using it to shame and to feel guilty? So we need to be able to have these discussions. Now, I get it. A lot of people will say, listen, this isn't canceling, this is fine, this isn't a First Amendment issue because this is a private company. I mean, we could have a debate about that because ABC, which I believe is what the network that The View is on, they rent the federal airwaves and all of that. But nonetheless, the argument often when it comes to whether or not this is a First Amendment issue, people often reel into the discussion of it isn't because it's a private company. But listen, whether it be a First Amendment issue or not, shouldn't be a discussion that shouldn't be the point. The point for us as a free nation, it isn't just that we're free because our government lets us be free. We're free because we allow each other to be free. So we have to have reckoning, I believe, in our culture of, are we going to be a culture of freedom, or are we going to be a culture of censorship? And that is something that we give to one another. It's not just the government that is over us and they're the ones that decide what we can and cannot say, and it's about whether or not we're going to be harmed by the government or thrown into prison by the government. It's about how we interact with one another, the culture that we have with each other. Are we going to be censoring each other, or are we going to allow each other the freedom of having some discussion? And that is, I think, a big aspect missing from the debate when we do talk about freedom of speech. It often just goes into this First Amendment versus private companies, and they can do whatever they want. But really, we should be talking about how we treat each other, how we want each other to behave, how we want this country to be as a culture. That is the big issue, I think, the big takeaway with this. And I want to ask you.
Bingo. How we treat each other. We are free because we allow each other to be free. A nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the soul of its people. Mahatma Gandhi. And that's really the crux. Now, if you want to follow Kim Iversen, she has a locals.com community. It's a website, I'll be very honest with you, I don't know a whole lot about, but it's real easy to find. It's Kim Iversen, KIMIVERSEN .locals, LOCALS.com. And there are many people over here at the locals.com community. If you want to join her community, you can find her here. I will, of course, put a link down in the description. It's basically a lot like what we do over at Patreon. It's basically the same thing. And this is really the direction our country is going and the world is going. If you want to talk about free speech, that's great. But talk is cheap, isn't it? Even the founding fathers said, we pledge our common fortunes to this cause, meaning they laid everything on the line. And they didn't just talk about freedom and liberty, they paid for it. And if something is free, you are the commodity. If something is free, you are the commodity. Venezuela. There are stories coming out of Venezuela now that completely debunk the narrative that you have heard from 2014 on. What's the narrative? Oh, evil, terrible, horrible socialism caused the collapse of the Bolivar, and this is what happens always, and because of what happened back in 19 whatever in Russia and blah, 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 Bolshevik revolution. It's garbage. It's total garbage. Any country would collapse if the holder of the world's reserve currency decided that was to be so. And that's what happened in Venezuela. The holder of the world's reserve currency, the United States, decided they didn't like who was in charge in Venezuela. And so they attempted to promote regime change. But they ran into something they didn't count on. People wanting liberty. People wanting freedom. People wanting, pay attention here, this is the most important part. People wanting a preservation of their culture. People who wanted a preservation of their culture fought back. And what do we see now? This is what we see. Florida Maki, wait a minute, I'm confused. How did we go from Venezuela to a plate of delicious barbecued shrimp? Venezuelan economy returns to growth as price rises slow. See, many people don't know that Venezuelans are being deported from the United States to Colombia. After 99.99% plunge, Venezuela's bolivar has finally stabilized. But how? Did Venezuela decide to announce it's no longer going to be socialist? No. In fact, quite the opposite. You see, what the U.S. did by preventing companies from supporting the oil rigs was cook up a fake scheme. You see, you can't pump oil unless you have functioning oil rigs, right? Well, what about the parts that you need to keep them running? Well, what happens if one country lays siege to another saying no one can import or export those parts? The oil production plummets. And when the money to the government plummets, then everything goes out of whack. It goes crazy. But about the shrimp, life after oil arrives in lake that minted hundreds of billions of dollars. Along Lake Maracaibo, Venezuelans come to grips with a post-oil reality and start carving out new business ventures. You see, oil production is actually ramping up. But they're doing it now in a sustainable way and cutting the United States out, and they don't want you to know this. Lake Maracaibo is, in many ways, the unlikeliest of homes for a burgeoning shrimp farm industry. After a century of relentless oil drilling, much of it carried out in a reckless and haphazard manner, meaning Shell, ConocoPhillips, BP, in the final years, its surface is stained by petroleum slicks and choked with rusted out rigs that stretch high into the sky. And yet it is fitting that it is here, in the shadow of the lake that produced hundreds of billions of dollars for government coffers and once made Venezuela one of the richest nations on earth, that a picture of the country's post-oil economy is beginning to take shape. Shrimp farms, big and small, are popping up all over, turning the low-lying, flood-prone lands that make up the Maracaibo Basin into a latticework of massive pools that grow the dark orange shrimp preferred by diners in many parts of Europe and Asia. Flash frozen and packed onto cargo ships, the shrimp fetch as much as $3 a pound, enough to generate some $150 million last year. This may not yet put Venezuela anywhere near the ranks of top global shrimp producers. The biggest sells 20 times as much, but it's a lot of money in an economy that has atrophied to just a quarter of its size a decade ago. See, this is the story. People say, wait a minute, I thought Venezuelans were just a bunch of lazy socialists sitting at home on their butt waiting for the government check, just like Washington, D.C. wants. No. Absolutely not the case. Lake Maracaibo was the virtual definition of paradise before big oil got a hold of it. It was this pristine, beautiful South American lake full of life, full of energy, in a way that you just can't imagine. The pictures are rare, if you can even find them, because it was for so long ago. The 1920s, the U.S. big oil machine ruined one of the globe's most beautiful assets in the name of cheap oil. And those of you out there who are big capitalist worshipers, I hope you're proud of yourself. Because it has taken almost a century and the expulsion of big oil from Venezuela for this lake to recover to the point where they can now harvest shrimp and start a new economy. Mark my words, in the next 20 years, South America and its industry and its exports will rule the world. Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, they are going to be the new big power players. and they are going to shape world events. I'm calling it right here. Kim Iversen, a California liberal, a progressive, literally just echoed what Mahatma Gandhi said. And if you go back and listen to the clip, it almost sounds like something Governor DeSantis himself would say about freedom of opinion, about freedom to be different. And that's really what Florida is all about. There's a lot of things I've talked about, even a lot of images that I've shown, that a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, McKee, I can't believe you showed those images. You see, in Florida, we do have diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, and we share that openly. Nobody's going to tell us what is right and what is wrong. We will determine that for ourselves. That's the whole point, like Kim Iversen said, of studying history. What is the point of studying history if we can't learn from it and be better going forward? We could all be better going forward, could we not? And I'll leave it there. God bless. Like, share, subscribe. Join us over at Patreon. Would love to have you there. We have a lot of great content. $1 US per month. Less than that if you sign up for a year. If you want to follow more of Kim Iversen, join her over at her locals community. It's basically the same deal. A little different machination, but those of you with even moderate intelligence, I'm sure, can navigate the website with no problem. So anyway, God bless. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you guys next time. Take care.